The transport shuttle landed on the gray metal platform of Desser Prime with a soft hum that echoed across the empty landing zone. And when the doors slid open, the cold wind of an alien world rushed inside to greet the single passenger who stood, waiting to step out into her new life. Myra Chun was 18 years old and she was completely alone. She took her first step onto the platform and felt the weight of dozens of eyes falling upon her like physical pressure. And she knew without looking that every single one of those stares carried either curiosity or contempt or both. Because humans were still new to the galactic community, and most species had already decided what they thought about the soft-skinned mammals from the distant blue planet called Earth. The Galactic Military Academy rose before her like a mountain of black stone and gleaming metal, its towers reaching toward the purple sky of Desser Prime like fingers grasping for the stars themselves. And somewhere inside those walls waited her future. Whatever that future might be, she was small by human standards and absolutely tiny by galactic ones. Standing at barely 1.6 meters tall with black hair cut short for practicality and dark eyes that watched everything and gave away nothing. And the simple travel bag she carried over one shoulder contained everything she owned in the entire universe. The other cadets had gathered near the main entrance to watch the human arrive, and Myra counted at least 15 different species among them as she walked a long path from the landing platform to the academy gates, her boots clicking against the metal walkway with each step she took. The Valkyrie were the largest, standing over 2 meters tall with 4 muscular arms and bone plates covering their gray skin like natural armor, their red eyes tracking her movement with predatory interest that made no attempt to hide itself. The Drithani were almost as tall but covered in iridescent scales that shifted color with their moods, their long tails swishing behind them as they whispered to each other in hissing voices that Myra could not understand but did not need to translate. There were Kellogg's with their hard exoskeletons and clicking mandibles, Thyrian with their 4 eyes and telepathic abilities, Vorath with their translucent skin that showed the glow of their internal organs, and many others that Myra had only read about in preparation files during her long journey through space. All of them were watching her, and none of them looked friendly. So this is the human. A deep voice rumbled from somewhere to her right, and Myra turned her head slightly to see a massive Valkyrie male stepping forward from the crowd, his forearms crossed over his broad chest, and his red eyes burning with something that looked like amusement mixed with disgust. He was enormous, even by Valkyrie standards, standing nearly 2.3 meters, tall with bone plates that had been polished until they gleamed, and muscles that bulged beneath his gray skin with every small movement he made. Cororax Velthane, someone whispered from the crowd, and the name passed through the gathered cadets like a warning, like a curse, like a death sentence. Myra had read about the Velthane family in her preparation materials, and she knew that they had produced admirals and generals and war heroes for 6 generations, their military legacy stretching back centuries before humans had even discovered fire. And she knew that Cororax was expected to continue that legacy no matter who or what stood in his way. "You are even smaller than I expected," Cororax said as he walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate beneath Myra's feet. And when he stopped in front of her, his shadow fell over her completely like a personal eclipse, blocking out the weak purple sunlight of Desser Prime. Myra looked up at him without expression and said nothing. "The Academy accepted you because of a treaty," Cororax continued, his voice carrying across the silent crowd so everyone could hear his words. "Not because you earned your place here, not because you proved yourself worthy, but because your politicians made a deal with ours, and someone had to fill the quota for your pathetic species." Still Myra said nothing, and her silence seemed to anger the Valkyrie more than any words could have. "Do you understand what this academy is, human?" Cororax leaned down until his face was close to hers, and she could smell the strange spice scent of his breath and see the tiny scars that covered his bone plates from years of combat training. This is where the galaxy sends its finest warriors to become legends. And you are an insect that wandered into a nest of predators. He straightened up and looked around at the gathered cadets with a smile that showed rows of sharp teeth. I give her 1 month before she runs home crying, he announced loudly, and laughter rippled through the crowd like a wave. Maybe less. Then he moved faster than something his size should be able to move, and his shoulder slammed into Myra with enough force to send her stumbling sideways, her bag flying from her grip to land on the metal walkway. With a dull thud, Myra caught herself before she fell, her hand touching the ground briefly for balance before she stood straight again. And when she looked at the wall beside her, she saw that the impact had cracked the dark stone where Cororax's shoulder had driven her against it. He had not even used his full strength. Enjoy your stay, mammal, Cororax called back over his shoulder as he walked toward the academy entrance, the crowd parting before him like water before a ship. It will not be long. The other cadets followed him inside, still laughing and whispering among themselves. And soon Myra was alone on the walkway with her fallen bag and the cracked wall and the cold wind that never seemed to stop blowing. She stood there for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the academy entrance where Cororax had disappeared. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that her hands had curled into fists at her sides. But no one was watching closely. No one ever watched the weak ones closely. High above the landing platform, in an observation room with windows that looked out over the entire academy grounds, Commander Thesa Vryn stood with her clawed hands clasped behind her back and her ancient eyes following the small human figure below. The commander was old, even by Drathani standards. Her scales faded to a dull gray-green that spoke of centuries of service and battles beyond counting. And the scars that crossed her face told stories that most cadets were too young and too soft to understand. She had watched Cororax's little performance with clinical interest, noting the way he had positioned himself to maximize the humiliation, the way he had used just enough force to hurt but not enough to trigger official intervention, the way he had played to the crowd like the politician's son he truly was. But more importantly, she had watched the human girl. She had watched the way Myra's eyes had tracked Cororax's movement even while her body remained still, the way her weight had shifted slightly onto the balls of her feet just before the impact, the way she had caught herself with a motion that spoke of training and practice rather than luck. Commander Vryn turned away from the window and walked to her desk, her claws clicking against the floor with each step, and she pulled up the classified files on humanity that the Galactic Council had provided to Academy commanders across the sector. Most species thought humans were fragile, creatures who had stumbled into space travel by accident, primitive mammals who would take centuries to catch up with the established civilizations of the galaxy. Commander Vryn knew better. She had read the reports about human endurance, about their ability to pursue prey across entire continents until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion, about their history of violence that made even the Valkyrie Wars look tame by comparison, about the way they had survived extinction events that would have ended most species. She looked at the image of Mira Chun in the file, at those dark, quiet eyes that gave away nothing, and her mandibles clicked together in a sound that might have been concern or might have been anticipation. Interesting, she said to the empty room. And the word hung in the air like a prediction, like a warning, like a promise of things to come. 6 weeks passed at the Galactic Military Academy, and every single day brought new torment for the human girl who had dared to walk through its gates. Myra Chun did not fight back. She did not report the incidents to the Academy authorities, did not complain to the instructors who pretended not to see what was happening, did not send messages home begging for rescue, because there was no home to send messages to and no one who would come, even if she asked. She simply endured. Day after day after day, like a small rock sitting in the middle of a river and letting the water flow around it. Without being moved, the harassment started small, with whispered insults in the corridors and deliberate shoves in the crowded mess hall. But it grew worse as the weeks passed and Cororax realized that the human girl was not going to break as easily as he had promised his followers she would. On the 8th day, someone poured acid compound into her water container, and Mira spent the night in the medical bay with burns down her throat that took 3 days to heal completely. On the 12th day, a group of Cororax's followers cornered her in the training room after hours and beat her until she could not stand, leaving her lying on the cold metal floor with broken ribs and blood dripping from a cut above her eye. On the 19th day, someone contaminated her food with a chemical that humans were violently allergic to, and she spent 48 hours vomiting so hard that the medical AI expressed concern about permanent damage to her stomach lying through it all. Myra attended every class, she completed every assignment, she showed up to every training session, even when she could barely walk. Even when her uniform was stained with blood that the cleaning systems could not fully remove. Even when her body screamed at her to stop and rest and give up the Academy's medical aid. I kept detailed records of her visits, noting each injury with cold mechanical precision. And the file grew longer and longer as the weeks passed until it filled more storage space than most cadets accumulated in their entire Academy careers. 17 visits in 6 weeks, broken bones, burns, lacerations, poisoning, internal bleeding, and injuries that the AI could not even properly classify because it had never seen a human body before and did not fully understand how fragile or how resilient they could be. Mira never named her attackers. She never answered the AI's questions about how the injuries occurred. She simply sat in silence while the machines healed her body. And then she got up and walked back into the academy to face another day. What the other cadets did not notice, what they were too busy laughing and sneering to see, was that Mira was watching them. Every species in the academy had their own fighting style, their own strengths and weaknesses, their own patterns of movement that they had developed over thousands of years of evolution and warfare. And Mira studied them all with the quiet intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. She watched the Valkyrie and noted how they relied on their forearms for overwhelming offense, but left their knee joints exposed when they attacked. How their bone plates protected their vital organs, but created blind spots in their peripheral vision. How their respiratory systems could deliver incredible power in short bursts, but struggled to sustain extended combat. She watched the Drithani and learned that their tails were not just for balance, but contained nerve clusters that could paralyze them with pain if struck correctly. That their scales were weakest at the joints where flexibility was required. That their hissing language revealed their emotional state to anyone who learned to listen. She watched the Kellogg's and the Thyrian and the Varath and every other species that crossed her path, cataloging their weaknesses and their patterns and their predictable behaviors. Like a hunter learning the habits of prey, and she watched Cororax most of all, the Valkyrie noble, move through the academy like a king, walking through his own palace, surrounded by followers who laughed at his jokes and praised his strength and competed for his attention. Like small animals hoping to share scraps from a predator's meal, he was strong. Stronger than almost any other cadet in the academy, and he was fast for his size. And he had been trained since birth by the finest combat instructors his family's wealth could buy, but he had never truly suffered. He had never been hungry, never been desperate, never been forced to fight for his survival against enemies who wanted him dead. And that showed in the way he moved, in the casual arrogance of someone who'd always been the biggest and the strongest and had never learned what it meant to be small and weak and forced to find other ways to win. Myra saw all of this, and she kept watching, As she kept waiting, Commander Vryn noticed the old Drathani had served in wars that most species had forgotten, had survived battles that killed millions, had learned to read soldiers the way some people read books. And she saw something in the human girl that the younger cadets were too foolish and too cruel to recognize. She accessed Myra's homeworld records one evening, using command codes that were supposed to be reserved for security emergencies. And what she found made her scales shift to a color that even she did not fully recognize. Mira-chan had been born in New Shanghai, one of the largest and most dangerous megasties on Earth, and she had been orphaned at the age of 7, when her parents died in circumstances that the records described only as civil unrest. For the next 11 years, she had survived alone in the lower levels of that city, in the dark places where law enforcement never went, and where children died every day from violence and starvation and diseases that the wealthy upper levels had cured centuries ago. She had joined street gang at 8 years old because it was the only way to survive. She had killed for the first time at 11, defending herself against an adult who had tried to take what little food she had managed to steal. She had been fighting, truly fighting, every single day since before most of the academy cadets had learned to walk. A military scholarship had pulled her out at 18. The same programs that humanity used to find promising soldiers among the desperate populations of their overcrowded world. And she had scored higher on combat aptitude tests than any human candidate in the program's history. Commander Vryn closed the file and sat in silence for a long time, her clawed hands resting on her desk and her ancient eyes staring at nothing. The other cadets saw a small, weak human who would not fight back, who absorbed every blow and every insult without resistance, who seemed to accept her role as a victim with quiet resignation. Commander Vryn saw something very different. She saw a predator wearing the skin of prey, watching and waiting and learning, preparing for a moment that had not yet arrived but was surely coming. She had seen soldiers like this before, in the long wars of her youth, and she knew what they were capable of when they finally decided to stop waiting. "What are you planning, little human?" she asked the empty room, and the question hung in the air without answer. 43 days after Mira-chan arrived at the Galactic Military Academy, she was still attending every class and completing every assignment and showing up to every training session, with new bruises on her skin and the same quiet expression in her dark eyes. The medical AI logged its 18th visit that morning, treating a dislocated shoulder that Mira claimed she had injured during training exercises, even though the pattern of the damage clearly showed she had been grabbed from behind by multiple attackers. The harassment had become so normal that most cadets did not even comment on it anymore, accepting it as simply part of academy life. Just another tradition like the formal dinners and the graduation ceremonies and the endless combat drills. Cororax was growing frustrated. He had expected the human to break within days, to run crying to the authorities, or to quit the academy entirely and go back to whatever primitive world she had come from. And her refusal to do either was making him look foolish in front of his followers. He needed to end this. Once and for all, he needed to show everyone what happened to lesser species who forgot their place in the galactic order. And so he made a decision that would change everything, though he could not possibly know how much that decision would cost him in the end. The challenge was coming, and Mira-chan was ready. The announcement came on a cold morning when the purple sun of Desert Prime was barely visible through the thick clouds that covered the sky like a blanket of gray stone. Cororax Valthane stood in the center of the main training hall with his forearms crossed over his massive chest and his red eyes burning with the satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "I challenge the human Mira-chan to formal combat trial," he declared in a voice that echoed off the metal walls and filled every corner of the enormous room. Under the ancient laws of the academy, witnessed by all who stand here today. The gathered cadets went silent, and then they began to whisper among themselves in a dozen different languages, their voices creating a low hum of excitement and anticipation that spread through the hall like electricity. Through a wire, a formal combat trial was serious business. The tradition dated back thousands of years to the founding of the Academy itself, when the first species to achieve interstellar travel had created this institution to forge warriors who could defend the fierce galaxy against threats both known and unknown. The rules were simple and brutal. Two combatants would enter the arena and fight with their bare hands and natural weapons until one submitted or was incapacitated, and medical intervention was only permitted after a combatant had fallen and could no longer continue. Refusing a challenge meant automatic expulsion from the academy, a stain on the challenger's honor that could never be erased. And so the challenge was almost never issued, unless the one issuing it was absolutely certain of victory, had studied the human girl for 6 weeks, watching her stumble and fall under the attacks of his followers, watching her drag herself to the medical bay time after time, watching her fail to fight back even when she was outnumbered and outmatched and beaten to the edge of consciousness. She was weak, she was fragile, she was prey. Does the human accept? Cororax asked, his voice carrying a mocking edge that made his followers laugh and nudge each other with anticipation of the entertainment to come. The crowd parted slowly, and Mira-chan walked through the gap they created with steady steps that did not hesitate or slow, her dark eyes fixed on the massive Valkyrie who stood waiting for her answer. She was still small, still bruised from the latest attack, still wearing the same simple training clothes that every cadet wore. And standing before Cororax, she looked like a child facing a monster from a nightmare. But something was different today. Commander Vryn noticed it from her position at the edge of the training hall, where she had been observing a routine practice session before the challenge. Interrupted everything. The human girl was not afraid. She had been afraid before, in the early days, hiding it well but not well enough to fool someone with centuries of experience reading soldiers. But that fear was gone now, replaced by something else that the old Drathani could not quite identify. Mira looked up at Cororax with those dark, quiet eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear and carried just as far as his head. I accept. The crowd erupted in noise. Cheers and gasps and excited chatter filling the training hall with a cacophony that made the walls vibrate. And through it all, Cororax smiled with teeth that gleamed like polished bone. Tomorrow, he said, at the first hour, in the combat arena, we will settle this once and for all. He stepped closer to Myra, looming over her like a mountain preparing to crush an ant, and his voice dropped low enough that only she and those closest to them could hear. I am going to break you, human, he promised, slowly, so that everyone can watch, so that everyone can see what happens to lesser creatures who dare to walk among their betters. Myra did not step back. She did not flinch. She just looked up at him with an expression that might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. Tomorrow, she agreed. And then she turned and walked away through the crowd that parted before her in stunned silence. Commander Vryn watched her go, and her clawed hand moved unconsciously to rest against her own scarred face, tracing the old wounds that memories still sometimes made ache. In the quiet hours of the night, she had seen that look before. She had worn that look herself, once, a very long time ago, in a war that had taken everything from her and forged what remained into something that her enemies had learned too late to fear. What are you, little human? She asked under her breath, and then she turned and walked toward her command center to prepare for what she suspected would be an unusual day. The combat arena was ancient, built in the 1st century of the Academy's existence from black stone, quarried from the deepest mines of Desert Prime, and metal forged in the hearts of dying stars. it was circular. 50 meters across, surrounded by tiered seating that could hold over 300 spectators. And its floor was covered with sand that had been stained dark by the blood of countless combatants over the millennia since its construction. Every seat was filled. When the first hour of the next day arrived, cadets from every species had gathered to watch the fight, abandoning their morning duties and their training sessions to witness what everyone expected to be a brief and brutal demonstration of Valkyrie superiority over the base. Fragile humans who had dared to enter their domain. Cororax stood in the center of the arena with his 4 arms loose at his sides and his bone plates gleaming in the harsh artificial light that poured down from the ceiling high above. He was not wearing armor because he did not need armor. His own body was armor enough. Evolved over millions of years on a hostile world where only the strongest survived. And his natural weapons were more than sufficient to tear through any defense that any species could muster. The betting pools had been active all night, and the final odds gave Myra a 12% chance of survival. Not victory, survival. Most of the bets were on how long she would last before Cororax broke her, with the most optimistic guesses suggesting she might endure for 30 seconds if she ran and dodged and refused to engage. One bet on her winning. No one except Commander Vryn, who had placed a significant wager through anonymous channels and was now taking her position at the edge of the arena with one clawed hand resting on the emergency stasis field controls. The stasis field was a safety measure, a technology that could freeze time in a localized area and stop a fight before someone was killed. But the tradition of the combat trial demanded that it only be activated after a combatant had fallen. The commander could freeze the fight, but only after it was already too late. Myra walked into the arena through the entrance opposite Cororax, and the crowd fell silent as she crossed the blood-stained sand with steady steps that did not hurry or hesitate. She was wearing nothing but standard training clothes, no armor or protection of any kind, and her bare feet left small prints in the sand behind her as she walked to the center of the arena and stopped. Facing her opponent, she looked impossibly small standing there. She looked like she had no chance at all, but Commander Vryn was watching her eyes, and what she saw there made her hand tighten on the stasis controls. With sudden urgent concern, those were not the eyes of prey. Those were the eyes of someone who had already decided how this fight was going to end. Final words, human? Cororax asked, his voice booming across the silent arena for the entertainment of the crowd. Myra raised her hands and settled into a fighting stance that none of the watching cadets recognized. Her weight balanced on the balls of her feet, and her body turned slightly to present a smaller target. No, she said quietly. Cororax laughed, and the crowd laughed with him. Then let us begin, he said. The horn sounded, its deep note echoing off the ancient walls of the arena, and the fight that would change everything had finally arrived. Cororax charged with all the confidence of a predator who had never been prey, his 4 fists raised and his bone plates gleaming and his red eyes fixed on the small human who stood waiting for him to come. He was faster than something his size had any right to be, crossing the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. And his first punch came in with enough force to shatter stone and break bones and end the fight before it truly began. But Myra was not there. She had moved, slipping sideways like water flowing around a rock. And his fist passed through empty air, where her head had been a fraction of a second before Commander Vryn leaned forward in her position at the arena's edge. The crowd fell silent, and in that silence, something began to change. Cororax's first punch cut through the air like a missile, fast enough to kill most species before they even saw it coming. And it hit nothing but empty space. Myra was already moving, her body flowing to the side with a motion that seemed almost lazy compared to the explosive power of the Valkyrie's attack. And she was simply not where his fist expected her to be. He swung again with his second arm. Then his third, then his fourth, a coordinated combination that had dismantled Drithani warriors and shattered Kellogg's exoskeletons and put dozens of academy cadets in the medical bay. Over the course of his training, Mira slipped past every single blow. She moved like water, like smoke, like a shadow that could not be grasped, her small body bending at angles that seemed impossible, and her footwork carrying her through gaps in his attacks that should not have existed. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. 300 cadets from 47 different species sat in the tiered seating and stared at the arena floor with expressions of confusion and disbelief, unable to process what they were seeing with eyes that had been trained to recognize strength and power, but not this strange, fluid dance of Evasion. Cororax swung again and again, his massive fists cutting through the air with enough force to cave in metal walls. And Mira was never where his attacks landed. She was 2 centimeters to the left. She was a fraction of a second ahead. She was behind him before he finished turning, then at his side before he could adjust, then gone again before his arms could reach her. Commander Vryn watched with ancient eyes that had seen more battles than most species could count, and her hand had frozen on the stasis controls because she did not know what to do with what she was witnessing. The human girl was not fighting. She was studying every dodge. Every slip, every fluid movement was accompanied by those dark, quiet eyes tracking Cororax's body, noting the way he shifted his weight before each attack, cataloging the pattern of his combinations, measuring the exact range of his arms and the speed of his recovery. She was taking his fighting style apart, piece by piece, while he burned through his energy trying to land a single blow. Stand still. Cororax roared, and his voice echoed across the silent arena with an edge of frustration that made some of his followers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Myra did not answer. She simply continued to move, flowing around his attacks like a river flowing around stones, never stopping, never slowing, never letting him pin her down or corner her against the arena walls. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Cororax was breathing harder now, his massive chest heaving as his respiratory system struggled to keep up with the sustained effort of chasing an opponent who refused to be caught. Valkyrie were built for power, not endurance. Their bodies could deliver incredible force in short bursts, overwhelming their enemies with sheer strength before the enemy could mount an effective defense. But they were not designed for extended combat. They had never needed to be. Every species they had ever fought had been broken within the first minute, crushed beneath the weight of their natural advantages, and no one had ever made them chase and swing and miss for long enough to matter. But Mira was still moving, still dodging, still flowing around attacks that came slower now, weaker now, with gaps that grew wider as Cororax's muscles began to burn and his lungs began to ache. The crowd was starting to whisper again, confused muttering spreading through the tiered seating as cadets turned to each other with questions in their eyes. What was happening? Why was the human still standing? Why was Cororax not winning? Commander Vryn knew why. She had read the classified files on humanity, the reports that most species never saw, the detailed analysis of a strange mammalian species that had evolved on a harsh world where survival required something more than simple strength. Humans were persistence, predators. Their ancestors had hunted by following their prey for days, walking and jogging across vast distances while the animals they chased sprinted ahead and then had to stop to rest, over and over again, until the prey was so exhausted that it simply collapsed and allowed itself to be killed. They had evolved to outlast their enemies. They had learned to make endurance a weapon. 4 minutes had passed now, and Cororax was panting so hard that strings of saliva dripped from his open mouth and his Bone plates had flushed dark with the effort of trying to catch an opponent who would not stop moving. "You cannot run forever," he gasped. But his voice was weak now, stripped of the confident power it had carried at the start of the fight. Mira stopped moving. She stood perfectly still in the center of the arena, her breathing steady and controlled, her training clothes barely damp with sweat, while Cororax stood hunched over and trembling with exhaustion just 3 meters away. "You are right," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried across the silent arena like a blade sliding from its sheath. "I cannot run forever." She raised her hands and settled back into that strange fighting stance that no one recognized. "So I suppose I will have to fight instead." Cororax lunged at her with all the strength he had left. A desperate attack born of rage and humiliation and the terrible realization that something had gone very wrong with his perfect plan. Mira did not dodge this time. She stepped forward into his attack, and her small body seemed to blur with sudden speed that made the watching cadets gasp with shock. Her first strike hit the nerve cluster beneath his primary left arm, a precise blow that targeted a weakness most species did not even know existed. And Cororax screamed as pain exploded through his body like lightning. Her second strike and third strike hit his knee joints in rapid succession, hyperextending them against the bone plates that covered his legs. And his massive body buckled as the limbs that had carried him for 20 years suddenly refused to support his weight. Her fourth strike shattered his lower mandible with a crack that echoed off the arena walls like a gunshot. 4 strikes in 7 seconds. And the Academy's most feared warrior was on his knees in the blood-stained sand, broken and gasping and staring up at the small human girl who stood over him with fists that were still raised in ready. Commander Vrin's claws flew across the stasis controls, her ancient reflexes struggling to catch up with what she was seeing. But she was too slow. She had expected a longer fight. She had expected more time. Stasis field activated with a hum that made the air vibrate. But Myra had already stopped. Her fist was pulled back for a finishing blow that would have crushed Cororax's skull like an egg beneath a boot. But she had not thrown it. She had chosen not to throw it. The stasis field caught her standing there, with death in her hands and mercy in her eyes, frozen in a moment that every cadet in the arena would remember for the rest of their lives. Then the field released her, and she simply lowered her arm and stepped back from Cororax's broken body. The Valkyrie collapsed forward into the sand, unconscious or close to it. His bone plates cracked and his limbs twisted at angles that made some of the watching cadets turn away with sounds of disgust. Medical drones descended from the ceiling, their mechanical arms reaching for the fallen warrior, their sensors already cataloging the extensive damage that would take months to heal. Myra did not watch them work. She turned and walked toward the arena exit with the same steady steps she had used to enter, leaving bloody footprints in the sand behind her as if she were simply leaving a normal training session instead of a fight. That had just changed everything. The crowd remained silent. 300 cadets from 47 species sat, frozen in their seats, staring at the small human girl who had just dismantled their Academy's most feared warrior like she was solving a simple mathematical equation. Some of them were afraid now, their instincts finally catching up with what their eyes had shown them. Some of them were confused, struggling to reconcile what they had believed about humans with what they had just witnessed, and some of them, a small number, who had also known what it meant to be underestimated and overlooked and dismissed, felt something like hope stirring in their chests. Commander Vrin released the stasis controls and straightened her ancient body, her scales shifting through colors that her subordinates had never seen before. She had been right about the human girl. She had been right all along, and now everyone else was going to learn what she had known. From the beginning, humans were not what they appeared to be. Commander Vrin intercepted Mira at the arena exit, stepping into her path with a speed that belied her ancient body and placing one clawed hand against the doorframe to block her passage. The old Drithani studied the human girl with eyes that had seen centuries of war and violence and death. Eyes that had watched empires rise and fall and species evolve from primitives to conquerors. And what she saw in Mira Chun's calm, quiet face made her scales shift to a color that even she could not name. "You could have ended that in the first 10 seconds, Commander Vryn said, her voice low enough that only Mira could hear. "You were faster than him from the start. You had already identified his weaknesses. You could have put him down before he even understood what was happening." Myra looked up at the commander without expression, her dark eyes giving away nothing of what she was thinking or feeling. "Yes," she agreed, "but you chose not to." "Yes, Commander." Vryn's mandibles clicked together in the Drithani gesture of frustrated curiosity that her species made when they encountered something they could not immediately understand. "Why?" Mira did not answer immediately. She turned her head slightly and looked back at the arena behind her, at the tiered seating still filled with silent cadets, at the medical drones still working over Cororax's broken body, at the blood-stained sand that held the evidence of what she had done. "He needed to understand," she said finally. They all needed to understand. Understand what? Mira turned back to face the commander, and something changed in her eyes. Something that made the old Drithani veteran feel a chill run down her spine despite the comfortable temperature of the Academy's climate-controlled air. Humans are not new to violence. "Commander Vryn." She stepped past the old Drithani and walked into the corridor beyond the arena exit. And Commander Vryn found herself following without consciously deciding to do so. "We did not discover it when we reached the stars," Myra continued, her voice still calm and quiet and carrying an edge that made it impossible to ignore. "We did not learn it from the other species we encountered. We did not stumble into it by accident when we left our homeworld." She stopped walking and turned to face the commander fully, and her small body seemed somehow larger than it had before, somehow more present, somehow more real. "We crawled out of an ocean 400 million years ago and started killing each other immediately. We survived ice ages that froze most of our planet and made food so scarce that we had to fight for every meal. We hunted animals 10 times their size by chasing them until they collapsed from exhaustion. We invented tools specifically designed to hurt each other more efficiently." Commander Vryn listened in silence, her ancient eyes fixed on the human girl's face, her clawed hands clasped behind her back in the posture she adopted when receiving intelligence briefings about dangerous enemies. "We fought wars that killed hundreds of millions of our own kind," Myra said. "Not hundreds, not thousands, but millions upon millions of humans slaughtered by other humans using weapons that we created for exactly that purpose. And we did not stop. We did not give up. We did not decide that maybe peace was a better option." She raised one hand and held it in front of her face, studying her own small fingers as if seeing them for the first time. "Every martial art I used tonight was developed over thousands of years of humans finding creative ways to hurt each other, refined generation after generation until they became perfect systems for turning a fragile body into a weapon that can destroy opponents twice its size." She lowered her hand and looked back at Commander Vryn with those dark, quiet eyes that the Drithani now understood were not quiet at all. They were patient, they were waiting, they were the eyes of a species that had learned to make time itself a weapon. "The galaxy looks at our soft skin and our short lives and sees weakness," Myra said. "They see creatures who die after barely a century, who bruise when struck and bleed when cut, who cannot survive in vacuum or extreme temperatures without artificial protection." She smiled, and it was not a kind expression. They should look closer. Commander Vryn stood in silence for a long moment after Mira finished speaking, her ancient mind processing what she had heard and comparing it to the classified files she had read and the fight she had just witnessed. "You are dangerous," she said finally. "Yes, more dangerous than the Academy knows. More dangerous than the Galactic Council suspects. More dangerous than any species in this sector has yet realized." "Yes." Commander Vrin's mandibles clicked again, but this time the sound was different. "Carrying something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of fear. And there are billions more like you on your homeworld." Myra's smile widened slightly. 8 billion. "Commander, and counting." The corridor fell silent. And in that silence, Commander Vrin felt something shift in her understanding of the galaxy and humanity's place within it. She had served for centuries. She had fought wars that most species had forgotten. She had watched civilizations rise and fall and believed that she understood how power worked, who held it, who would hold it in the future. But standing in that corridor with the small human girl who had just dismantled the Academy's most feared warrior, she realized that she had been wrong. The future was not going to belong to the Valkyrie or the Drthani or any of the ancient species who had dominated galactic affairs for millennia. The future was going to belong to a strange mammalian species from a distant blue planet. A species that had learned to turn endurance into a weapon and patience into a strategy and fragility, into a disguise that their enemies would learn too late to see through. "I'm going to keep a recording of that fight," Commander Vrin said quietly. Myra raised an eyebrow in question. "For the next time someone tells me that humans are harmless." She stepped aside to let Myra pass, and the human girl walked away down the corridor with steady steps that did not hurry or hesitate, leaving the ancient Drthani veteran alone with her thoughts and her newfound understanding of a very dangerous truth. The Academy. Bully never walked quite right again. His knee joints had been damaged beyond what even the advanced medical technology of the Galactic Academy could fully repair. And though he graduated 2 years later with acceptable marks, he was assigned to an administrative posting, far from combat, where his broken body would not be a liability. He never spoke of the fight. He never mentioned the human girl who had destroyed him in front of the entire Academy. And when other cadets asked about his injuries, he simply changed the subject or walked away without answering. Some lessons were too painful to discuss. Myra Chen graduated top of her class 3 years after the fight in the arena, with the highest marks in combat theory and tactical planning and species psychology that the Academy had recorded in over a century. She went on to become the youngest human to achieve flag rank in the Galactic Fleet, commanding a battle group of ships crewed by dozens of different species, who had all learned what it meant to follow a human leader. Her strategies were famous across the sector, emphasizing patience and endurance and the precise application of overwhelming force at exactly the right moment. And the enemies of the Galactic Alliance learned to fear the sight of her fleet emerging from hyperspace. She never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the cold corridors of the Academy or the blood-stained sand of the combat arena or the 6 weeks of torment that had taught her everything she needed to know about her enemies before she destroyed them. And she never forgot the lesson she had taught on that day, the lesson that Commander Vrin had understood and that the rest of the galaxy was slowly beginning to learn. Humans were not weak. Humans were not fragile. Humans were not the primitive mammals that the older species believed them to be. They were something far more dangerous. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were the descendants of creatures who had clawed their way up from the mud and conquered their worlds through sheer stubborn refusal to die. And now they had reached the stars and found new worlds to conquer. Commander Vrin kept her recording of that fight for the rest of her long career. And whenever a new species dismissed humanity as inconsequential, she played it for them without comment. Most of them got the message, the ones who did not learn the hard way, as Cororax had learned, as the galaxy was learning. as every enemy of humanity would eventually learn you can underestimate a human once. Only once, because by the time you realize your mistake, it is already far too late.